I am Erica Carroll. I am the Education and Training Manager here at Atlona. And with me today is our Senior Sales Engineer, Nick Bethard. And we'll be hearing from Nick in a few moments. But first, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today as we continue to unravel our feature sets in this Velocity series. And today's focus is on control automation. And today we're going to be talking specifically about macros and room triggers. So let's start with macros. What is a macro? Many of you may be familiar with a macro that's built in Excel, and that's where you're capturing keystrokes and mouse clicks to make repetitive tasks easier to execute with just the click of a button. Now that's the same concept that we're using here in Velocity. We're able to program a series of control commands that will fire with just one button. For example, let's say the way you're using a room changes. Maybe it's a restaurant that's going from daytime dining to like an open mic night. In this case, we need to control the technology in the room to lower the shades or adjust the lightings or even reroute audio or video distribution. And with just one macro, we can do all of these things with just the press of one button. Next is event macros. Now, unlike macro buttons, event macros are triggered by something else in the system, not by a person presenting or not by a person pressing a button. A common event macro would be triggered from another event that occurs in the system. Something as simple as the time could trigger an event macro. With a scheduled time macro, the Velocity system will fire a series of commands at that specific time, either daily or weekly. So this is handy if at 7 a.m. every morning you want a room to turn on, and at 9 p.m. every night you want to be sure the room is turned off by the time everyone has gone home for the day. And finally, for automation, we'll cover room triggers. Now, a room trigger is a variation of an event macro. Event macros are triggered by the system, and these room triggers are triggered by the system listening to messages that are coming from a device that is configured in the room. And by utilizing a VCC or Velocity Control Converter, the gateway can trigger a macro from something as simple as the open and close state of a relay. So with that introduction of controls, I'm going to go ahead and hand controls over to Nick so he can go over what each one of these does in a real life application.
Hey everybody, so give me 1 second. I will show you my screen. There we go. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to use sort of a scenario to show you guys what we're talking about here. And that scenario is going to be a simple divisible space. Now granted, if for those of you that might be familiar with doing simple divisible spaces in Velocity, you might be thinking to yourself, this isn't the right way to do a simple two-way divisible space. And you'd be right, there's a simpler way than this. This is how we would do bigger divisible spaces, like a three-way, four-way, five-way divisible space. But I just thought it would be useful to show this method because it leverages all of the things that Erica was just talking about. Excuse me. So basically what we have is we have, a two-way divisible space. So there's basically, two states that each room can be in. They're either separate, the left side or the right side, or they're combined. So we've got all that set up, and then we've got a control room here. So I'm going to go into this control room because that's where all my macros and event triggers and all of that stuff is all set up. So if I go into room control options, then we see the screen with, under automation where we see our macros, event macros, room triggers, variables. One thing that, I want to mention, that we're going to use here is a little bit, is variables. So you can actually define, your own variables for the system to use, which you're going to see some of that here in what I've got set up. So basically I made a variable. Now this is my test system, so it's got a lot of variables defined, but this variable right here, this airwall1 variable, is the variable that we are going to kind of leverage. And basically what we're saying with this variable is whether the air wall is open or closed. So since it's a simple two-way space, there's only one air wall, so that's all we're worried about. So first, let me show you a regular macro. And again, this is, like Erica said, this is a macro that's going to happen um, because the user did something, on Velocity, and I'll show you that in a little while. So if I click into here, we see I basically set up an airwall toggle macro. And if I expand this guy down, basically what I did was I set up a simple if then else statement to toggle that variable open and closed using a button on the control panel. So basically I said if the airwall1 variable equals 0, then I'm going to change that to 1. Otherwise, if it's not equal to 0, that means it's equal to 1, so I'm going to toggle it back to 0. Very simple. And I'll show you that in action here in just a little while. So now that's kind of a manual way that gives us a manual way, to open and close the room, to open and close that air wall. What about an automated way? So we saw we have in the room, we have a VCC relay, that we could have connected to an air wall sensor, simple contact closure type output air wall sensor. So let's set up some automation. So as Erica kind of alluded to, the type of thing that we want to use here is a room trigger, because basically what we want to do is we want to listen to that VCC relay and listen for it to tell us that, its input is either open or closed. So if I go into room triggers, then we're going to see I've got a couple of room triggers set up based on that VCC relay. One is opened and one is closed. So basically, if that VCC relay sees that its sensor contact is open, then we're going to assume that the air wall is open, and that means that we're going to set the air wall variable to 0. 0 means open. And conversely, if it sees that sensor's contact closure is closed, then we're going to do the inverse. We're going to set that airwall1 variable to a value of 1. Okay, great. So what we've done is we've given a way to manually tell the system that the airwall is open or closed using the macro, or we've given it a way to automatically tell based on an airwall sensor. What do we do with that? We haven't actually done anything. So this is where we go into event macros. Because now what we want to do is we want to trigger things to happen based on that external event or even the internal event, again, based on that variable changing. So if we go into event macros, let's go here. Basically, I've got a couple of event macros set up here, one for room split, one for room combine. And, as Erica kind of alluded to, there's a lot of internal events that you can trigger off of, things like the room turned on, the room turned off. You can schedule things to happen. But the thing that we're going to leverage here is variable updated. So basically, we're telling Velocity to watch for the airwall1 variable to be updated to a value of 1. And that means, because remember, airwall1 being equal to 1, that variable being equal to 1 means the room is split. So as soon as Velocity sees that the room is split, then it's going to go and it's going to execute this macro. And basically what we're doing is we're forcing the touch panels to navigate pages. So if the room is split, we're going to trigger my control screen, and I've got that open, and I've got those open in a couple of other browsers, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But the one that I've got open in Edge, I'm going to move to the webinar left room, and the other control screen, I'm going to open to the webinar right room. Now, if somebody comes along and either hits that macro to toggle that variable, or somebody closes that air wall and triggers that VCC relay, then we're going to combine the room, or I'm sorry, not close the air wall, but open the air wall. We're going to combine that room into one big, huge space. So Velocity is going to see that variable is going to get updated to 0, for open, and it's going to execute a different couple of page navigations where it's going to navigate basically both control panels to the combined room. So we're going to see that happen here in just a little bit. So that's it. That's, so here in a really simple little divisible space, we're going to make use of macros, event macros, and room triggers and variables all right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up my couple of control surfaces. So there, now you can see using the beauty of Velocity's ability to basically make anything a control surface that has an HTML5 browser. I've got one control surface over here open in Edge, and I've got one control surface open over here in Firefox. Easy peasy. One for the left and one for the right. And I can, navigate sources, I can do all stuff. It's a control surface, no big deal. So these are separate and independent right now. But what happens is if I go and I hit this Airwall toggle button, which again, this is just linked back to that macro that I showed you just a little while ago, then it's going to set that Airwall variable. Right now we're in a split situation where the Airwall's closed. So we're going to go ahead and open that Airwall. We're going to toggle that variable by opening that Airwall. And what we're going to see happen is both control surfaces are going to automatically react and navigate to the combined page. And so now they're actually shared control surfaces. So we can actually, make a change on one, and we see that update on both simultaneously. So if we go back here, now we see it update on both. And of course, we can go back and we can close that Airwall again just by hitting Airwall toggle, boom, and all of a sudden now the Airwall is closed and the system reacted using that event macro that I showed, or the event macro I showed you. And we're back to a split situation where the touch panels are reflecting the individual rooms that they're now in. And that's it. Simple usage of macros, event macros, room triggers, and variables.